the seasons where you hear nothing. May your hand still be steady and your footsteps sure, so that you can work with Jesus nonetheless. And finally, may you grow unceasingly in friendship with Jesus and enter ever more deeply into your Master's joy. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to John chapter 21, but we'll start in verse 30 of chapter 20, so just above that. And we're going to focus in this session on this appearance that Jesus gives to 7 disciples along the Sea of Galilee. And in it, what we'll see is a kind of a pattern for how he goes about providing for his community post-resurrection. And so that's where we're headed. But in order to get the sense of how this works, let's start a couple verses above. Let's look at chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, because John here, he tells us how to read his book, okay? Or at least something very important about that. He tells us that it's a book of signs, okay? A book of signs. And so it starts this way. Many other signs, therefore, Jesus performed in the presence of his students. But these signs, which are written in this book, they've been written in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing you may have life in his name. Right? So he tells us that this is a book of signs, and it's worth just kind of pausing to think about that, because that'll help us know how to read this next bit, this particular appearance. What's a sign? How do signs work? Right? What a sign does is it's something that when you think of it or look at it, it casts your attention. It directs you to what it's referring to, beyond itself to something else, right? And so really the most elemental form of a sign is this, right? You point, right? And we're actually rather extraordinarily good as human beings at kind of following, even just glancing like this, you know. And you've had these conversations. Somebody comes up and asks you something, you kind of, it's like he's over there, or right, and you get it. Like you can follow even just by kind of the glance of the eye. You know not to just look into the eye, but you look at what the eye's looking at, right? And kind of the movement from that to a gesture of a finger pointing. You know that if you want to understand what the person is trying to communicate, you don't fixate on the finger, right? You're not going to get it by looking closely at the knuckle, right? Or checking out the fingernail. You follow what it's gesturing towards, right? That's how signs work, generally. And so when you come across, a big red sign with a white, band through the middle of it, that's supposed to not capture your attention as, an aesthetic something, but to make you think, oh, oncoming traffic, don't enter, all of this, right? So John's book is a book of signs. And that means that when we read this, we need to not only think of it as an event that happens. Yes, these are events that happen, okay? But these events gesture beyond themselves to something else. And now, so part of what you want to ask as you read, or just kind of notice, is what truth about God at work in this world, about life together with Jesus in his way, what is it gesturing towards? Because it's not only telling us about something that happened then, but it's telling us about a truth about how God works in this world. And so um, I'll just pause. Sometimes that's made people nervous over the ages. There was at least a long period where in like academic studies, you would find people asking the question, is this symbolic or did it really happen? And I just want to suggest that there's no reason to have a divide there. Symbols happen, right? Symbolic things happen. It's both, okay? It's both. So what happens in this present story is that Jesus appears to 7 disciples on the shore of Galilee, and what this gestures toward, this event, there's a pattern in how he interacts with his students here on the side of Galilee that gestures toward, it kind of contains a pattern in seed form of something that happens over and over and over again within this community of the resurrected one that we call church. Okay? And so as what we're going to do is we read through, we'll work at both of those. So he's there with the disciples, and he's also indicating kind of how he takes care of a community. And so we'll read both of those side by side as we go through this. And, without knowing the story of this particular community in any depth, I'm just going to, I'll wager, I don't have money, but, let's just hypothetically, I'm going to bet that this pattern has played itself out here probably more than once already, okay? And so you tell me if I'm wrong by the time we get to the end of this, but I'm going to suspect that you've seen this sort of thing happen. Okay, so let's go through this just a little bit at a time. So after these things, verse 1, after these things, Jesus manifested himself, made himself visible again to his students along the Sea of Tiberias, which is Galilee. And he made himself visible in this way. Simon Peter and Thomas, who's called the twin, and Nathaniel, who's from Cana of Galilee, and the Zebedee brothers, and 2 other of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter says, I'm going fishing. They say, okay, well, then we're coming with you. So they go out, get into the boat, and that night, they don't catch anything. They catch nothing. The first element of this pattern that we see is that there comes a moment within a community following Jesus in which business as usual kind of stops working. Right? Members of Jesus's community, they're engaging in the activities they always have. It's not that they're unfaithful or anything like that. They're doing the good that they know to do, but the results have changed. Okay, there's this moment of stagnation. Something shifted. It's not clear what, right? But something has shifted, and so this group of Jesus's students, they're fishermen, right? They have a kind of a zone of acquired competence. They've done this over and over again. They were good enough at it to own multiple boats and have employees under them and all of that. They know what they're doing out there, and they've done it over and over and over again. But this night it's fruitless. Right? It's not that they go out and they don't get a substantial catch or it's less than you. Nothing. Right? Not a single one. Not a single one. Right? Something's changed. What? I don't know. Right? We don't know yet at this point. But something has shifted. And so efforts start feeling futile within a community at this moment. And we just, we don't know exactly why, but things aren't working the way they used to. Now, in my own ministry and the communities I've served among, we've gone through this different times, right? where kind of there's a set focus to the ministry, and we're moving forward, and things have been going fine, and then all of a sudden something changes, right? Most recently, back in Greece, when we went over, we spent the first 5 years really focused on refugee work, and it was fruitful in all sorts of ways. And then there was this shift. In that case, part of what happened was just like people left, right? But over the course of just, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, 6 at the most, we went from, quite a number of refugees that were apprenticing to they get asylum and poop, 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 all gone, right? It's just, whoa, what next? What next? And then there were, about the same time within that, there were some that kind of went bad, so to speak. Anyhow, so it was like the work that we were doing, all of a sudden it just shifted. Like, not that we changed anything, it just changed, right? And there was this kind of, what next? What next? Now, verses 4 and 5. So at this point, what happens is you find Jesus he enters in unrecognizable, right? And he just kind of calls attention really gently to this new ineffectiveness, right? Something's changed, right? And so, verse 4, when it had already become morning, Jesus stood on the seashore. But the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. And so Jesus says to them, children, you don't have anything to eat, do you? You don't have any fish, do you? Right? And they responded to him, no. And so he said to them, cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll make a discovery. Okay, and so they cast it, and they were no longer strong enough to pull it in because of the multitude of fish that's in it. I overshot a little bit. Let's pause there. So Jesus shows up, and he calls attention. And as we've said already, it's characteristic during these 40 days because of what we've already talked about, his wanting to train us to be able to recognize him by what he says and does, not just by the look of his face, right? But it's characteristic that when he shows up, he's not recognizable as the same guy, right? There's just one exception to this. That's where people immediately know who he is. And so, at this stage in the crisis, this kind of early stage, Jesus appears he's the one who's willing to come in and just say out loud, notice what anybody could notice if they wanted to pay attention to it. He's the one who will say, something's changed. How's that working? Why isn't that working? Right? Children, you don't have any fish, do you? Right? And so at this point, Jesus, still unrecognized, he calls for this small act of obedience. This is verses 6 and 7. And I'll read it again. So he says, cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find something. Therefore, they cast their net, and they were no longer strong enough to pull it in because of the multitude of fish. Therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, it's the Lord. It's the Lord. Okay. So what happens here is Jesus, he enters into the community having kind of pointed out the ineffectiveness. He then kind of calls for a small act of obedience, right? To do something a bit different. And when that happens, when they respond in obedience, what follows is a kind of fruitfulness. There's this sudden effectiveness that actually creates a new problem. It's an unmanageable fruitfulness that takes place here. There's too many fish for them to be able to get it into the boat, right? So you move from the problem of things aren't working anymore to they're working too well, but in a way we don't know what to do with, right? And so, and in the midst of that kind of moment of chaos, of unmanageable fruitfulness, Jesus is recognized by somebody in the community. Okay. Now, part of what's going on here is that this event, on the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection, it rhymes, if I can put it that way. It shares some distinctive features of an event earlier in Jesus' ministry. Back in Luke chapter 5, you remember early in Peter's interaction with Jesus, Jesus, they've had a similar thing. They haven't caught fish. Jesus says, cast the net out on the other side, and now they can't pull it in, right? So it's very, very, very similar. It's not identical, but very, very similar to what's going on here. And what happens at that time is Peter protests, right? He not strongly, but he says, we worked all night, we haven't caught anything, right? But then, just out of respect for Jesus, he does it, right? But at your word, I'll let in, right? And when he does that, there's this kind of astounding result. Now, so the call for obedience is something that comes in their zone of competence. In their zone of competence. And that's worth thinking about because it's not like, Peter, like these guys, they don't know what they're doing. And so it's the sort of place where sometimes we'd be willing or kind of inclined to think that, who are you to tell me what to do? Right? Who are you to say this? I mean, I kind of know what I'm doing here, kind of known for this thing, right? And Jesus says, try this. And we have that option. Like we can risk a little obedience, right? And it's a small thing. It's a small act of obedience, right? But when we do that, then suddenly there's a response that, like I said, it creates its own new problem. There's a kind of a shocking success, and they don't know what to do with it. And this is nothing new to the Jesus movement. I'll keep going back and forth between our experiences and things that you see in the early church, but we're kind of going through something similar right now, where after the refugees left, there was this, what do we do, right? And then there was this moment where somebody reached out and said, would you do things with us here, right? With North Macedonians, with Greeks and so forth. And so we did. And then there was the possibility of getting this library, which we did. So we brought in a 30,000 volume library, and it's turned into this whole community center. And there's this kind of sudden kind of influx of people and activities and all of that frankly we cannot keep up with. Okay, we're in over our head. Right? But what happened in all of that is that Jesus is doing something beyond us. Right? Our obedience just kind of cracked a door, right? And all kinds of other people. He's using all kinds of other people besides us in this, but it is quite unmanageable, at the moment, right? Now, this is not new to the Jesus movement. If you just kind of think through Acts, you're going to see a similar thing, similar sorts of things take place. So, for instance, go to say chapter 6 of Acts, and basic faithfulness in taking care of the orphans and widows, just providing for the people around them, ministering in that way, has led to this kind of sudden growth that the community can't keep up all of a sudden. That it's just, it outstrips all their capacities. And so what do you do, right? What do? You just can't keep up. And so you kind of get this strange thing where the blessings become their own problem, right? And that's what happens at this moment. Now, what's really important is the next thing, okay? Because the next thing that happens here in the kind of the second part of verse 7 and into verse 8 is that you have one person, as the community's overwhelmed, as everything's in a bit of turmoil because of this new fruitfulness, you've got one person that kind of pulls out from management and draws near to Jesus. Okay? And that starts a kind of a new moment here. And so it says, therefore, Simon Peter, when he heard that it's the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him because he was stripped for work, right? And threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in the boat because they weren't far from the land, but were about 200 cubits, 100 yards. And they were dragging the net of the fish. Okay, so they catch all these fish, and it's more than they can handle. So you've got these 7 guys in the boat, and they're trying to manage this net full of fish, and it's too strong for them. But they're in the midst of that. Peter, he just says, I've got to get to Jesus, right? I've got to get to Jesus. And, Peter's impulsive, right? This is, famously so, right? It just, this is who he is. So when he knows that Jesus is on the shore, he just kind of that's the one thing. So he leaves everybody behind, dealing with, managing the crisis, dealing with what's suddenly become their unmanageable fruitfulness, right? He makes the minimal preparation for decency and kind of jumps in the sea, and he gets over. So while the community is kind of desperate to find a way to manage, he's desperate to get to Jesus, right? To talk with him. And, I don't know if Peter even knew what he wanted to say or do with Jesus, but he gets there, right? And as he draws near to Jesus, this is important to notice, Jesus has not forgotten the community that is struggling. Jesus has not forgotten that, even as he receives Peter. And so one way you could look at this, it sometimes feels like it's rather self-indulgent of the person that kind of pulls out to draw near, because so much is going on, right? And we're all strained, right? And we can't keep up with this. And why aren't you here trying to, with us, right? But the Lord actually, He's going to use the fact that one person draws near in a new way to alter things for the whole community. Okay? And this is important because it's part of the dynamic by which He provides for, the resurrected one provides for his community is going to have to do with gifting particular people within that to do things that maybe even the whole community together wouldn't be capable of doing apart from that special gifting. And so, again, this is a pattern that you see. So part of what's going on right now, when we started this kind of spiritual resource center, community center at the library, I had all these ideas of things that we'd love to see happen. And I, in my imagination, these are all things I'd love to do, right? And so we'll do book club, and we'll have discussion groups, and things like this. And part of what has happened is, I don't have the bandwidth to do all of that, but God is kind of bringing other people in, or who are showing up to they show up. They have a discussion group, but there's no place to host it, and they want to do this, and it's aligned with, right? And so he's bringing that in book club, things like that. So he's bringing others in. And there's a similar sort of thing here that repeats all the way through the church's history. Go back to the Jerusalem community, that issue in Acts chapter 6. And what you see is that the apostles, they seek the Lord in the midst of this kind of crisis, and it leads to a certain handoff and to the appointing of deacons, of new servants, to take care of this issue. If the Greek-speaking widows aren't getting food, let's find Greek-speaking servants to take care of them, right? And so there's a kind of turnover. There's a new type of leadership that emerges to deal with this new fruitfulness, right? Now, so Peter draws near. Now, at this point, verse 9, right? When in the boat, therefore, when they came up to land, they saw a charcoal fire laid with fish and bread laid upon it. At this point, as they reach the edge, what they see is that Jesus already has resources for them, and he's already making provision. He's already making provision. So even when they're out at sea, not catching anything, and then in the midst of all of the chaos that comes from this little act of obedience, Jesus, he already has breakfast ready. Okay? It is generally true that whether we can see it or not, Jesus already has the resources needed for what he's doing in his community. Okay? We can trust that. Okay? And at the moment where they're needed, they will be revealed. We will see them. Okay? We will see them. Now, verses 10 and 11. Okay? This is the point at which you see Jesus kind of empowering somebody in a special way. So Jesus says to them, bring some of the fish that y'all caught. Therefore, I love this. Simon Peter went and takes up the net onto the land, and it's full of 153 big fish. And even though there were so many, the net did not tear, was not torn. Okay, the net was not torn. At this point, you see Jesus empowering a particular person to do something that even kind of that little community as a whole wasn't capable of doing together on their own, right? So remember, you've got 6 guys that are doing all they can to drag this thing, and they can't get it out of the sea, right? And Jesus says, okay, go get some fish. And Peter walks over all by himself, pulls this thing together, and takes it up onto the land. Okay, it's a rather prodigious strength feat, and forgive me, you've got to. So sometimes language helps, and sometimes it's stone lifting that makes you think of these things. But seriously, if you think about 153 big fish, if you imagine that they're a kilo, like 2.5 pounds per fish, that's a lot of weight. This big, awkward, wiggly mass. That would be a very impressive lift. And it's not just that Peter is, as it were, given the strength to do it. It's that the net doesn't rip, right? The net doesn't tear apart even under all that pressure. There's again, remember, it's a sign. So it's not just about lifting the net. It's that this is a sign for how God takes care of his community by gifting particular people within it. And if the community can receive those gifts, if the people who have those gifts are able are received to use them there, then things happen within the community that couldn't happen otherwise, and the unity can be held together, right? There's no tearing, there's no ripping, right? And so, in these moments of sudden growth, fruitfulness, there's a lot of centrifugal forces, right? When things get the 6 guys couldn't do it, is given the ability to do it. The apostles